Na estreia do Midiosfera Entrevista, o convidado é muito especial. Ele é um jornalista indiano-americano, comentarista político, escritor, apresentador do principal programa de assuntos internacionais da CNN americana e colunista do Washington Post. Um dos 10 maiores pensadores da última década, segundo a revista Foreign Policy. E está aqui hoje para falar sobre o seu novo livro, 10 Lições para o Mundo Pós-Pandemia, que será lançado no Brasil agora, dia 24 de fevereiro. Zakaria, é uma grande honra, bem-vindo.
It's my pleasure to be on.
Farid, eu estava assistindo o teu programa em junho de 2017, quando você fez a seguinte previsão, abre aspas. Uma das maiores ameaças com as quais os Estados Unidos se defrontam não é grande. Na verdade, é minúscula, microscópica, milhares de vezes menor que a cabeça de um alfinete. Patógenos mortais, sejam artificiais ou naturais, poderiam desencadear uma crise sanitária global. Quando a crise chegar, desejaremos ter mais financiamento e mais cooperação global, mas então será tarde demais. Bem, Farid, como todos sabemos agora, foi tarde demais. Você estava certo, então eu te convido para especular sobre o que vem depois. A peste negra ajudou a acabar com o feudalismo e a servidão. A Grande Depressão abriu caminho para o fascismo e para o New Deal americano. O que o Covid nos trará, Farid?
Well, I think you're right. We were too late. We had many warnings. The truth is, when I made that prediction 3 years before the pandemic, it did not take any special foresight. I wish I could pretend that I was somehow uniquely brilliant about it. I wasn't. I was just reading what the scientists were saying. I was reading what Bill Gates was saying. By then, it was pretty clear, and I wrote that actually. That section of the show was in response to the fact that Donald Trump, as president, had begun cutting funding for the public health agencies and the preparedness budget for precisely the pandemic that we ended up having. So it should come as no surprise that the American government, at least, performed badly because we had been cutting funding for these budgets for a long time. Now, what happens going forward? First, it's important to realize this is the biggest event we will have ever lived through, because it's affecting everybody in the world. Everybody in the world. Think about it for Brazil. 9/11, it didn't really make that much difference day to day to a Brazilian's life. It was something between the United States and the Middle East. The global financial crisis, Brazilians did not have these complex derivative products and things like that. This pandemic has affected every person in Brazil. It has affected every person in India. It has affected every person in Japan. The whole world is going through this. So at one level, just psychologically, think about what that is going to do to all of us. We have been forced to stop working or to isolate or to not see our loved ones, maybe grandparents, maybe grandchildren. And this is going on for a long time. My prediction is that 2021 will look a lot more like 2020 than people realize. Many parts of the world will not get vaccinated by the end of 2021. It will only happen in 2022. So we are talking about almost 2 years where this pandemic is going to course through, and the shutdowns and the lockdowns and the social distancing and the online learning, all that will continue. So we are going to be shaped by this in a way that perhaps, World War II shaped a generation, World War I shaped a generation. The one thing I worry most about it, there are lots of wonderful things we can talk about that have come about as a result of this. But since you put it in the terms you did with the question, the thing I worry most about is the dramatic increase in inequality, which was in any case a growing problem in the world. But in the United States, and I'm sure this is true in Brazil, we have divided now into two worlds. A world of a kind of digital elite, people who can surf the web, surf the digital world, work in the digital economy, and generate about the same amount of income as they were generating before. In some cases, a lot more. Like the Amazons of the world have done much better. And then there is the people who are not part of that digital world. Everybody working in a restaurant, a hotel, a cruise ship, a theme park, in retail stores. All those people, for them, this is a depression. This is like the Great Depression. And that divide between a digital elite and the non-digital working class, if you will, is going to persist for a long time. You are going to see it reinforced in corporate ways where the companies that are digitally savvy, like the Amazons of the world, thrive, but your local bookstore goes out of business because it does not have a website, it does not have delivery. And that process is going to just widen and widen and widen. And I worry a lot about what that means politically, what that means culturally, what that means socially.
Farid, algumas pessoas sugerem que a pandemia será um momento que vai mudar o curso da história para sempre. Outros acreditam que depois da vacina vamos retornar rapidamente à vida normal. Você, por outro lado, argumenta que a pandemia não vai remodelar a história, mas acelerá-la. Você pode falar um pouco mais sobre isso?
Sure. So, one of the things you realize about this pandemic is it is sort of intensifying trends that were already beginning. It's intensifying this movement toward a digital economy, which was already happening, but it has put it on steroids, if you will. It's moving faster and more fast forward than we've ever seen. I give you a simple example. My book is I write about this in the book, but the book is itself an example of this. So in book publishing, in book sales, at least in America, the pandemic has been good for business because it turns out not everyone is watching TV. There are a few people like you who are reading books, and that book readership has gone up over the pandemic. So book sales are up 15% in America, but where you are buying the books from has changed. Amazon was 30% of the book sales market when I started writing this book. Now that I'm publishing this book, Amazon is 65% of book sales in America. So it has more than doubled its market share. Take another example. People were very reluctant to go to a doctor for medical advice online. Very inefficient, but if somebody was just not feeling well, they would want to go and see the doctor personally. And they would say to the doctor, this is what's happening. And the doctor would say, you have a headache, go take an aspirin. If it continues, call me tomorrow. But to do that, think about how inefficient it was. The patient would come to see the doctor, wait in a waiting room, the doctor would see them. The whole thing would take 2.5 hours probably if you count up all the travel time. The patient was psychologically unwilling to make the transition. The doctor was financially unwilling because they didn't get paid for the online visit. The pandemic broke both barriers. And that, as a result of that, in the United States at least, in 2020, there were 1 billion visits between doctors and patients online. So you see, this is the kind of thing that is being accelerated. Inequality is being accelerated. The divide between the rich and poor is being accelerated. Even geopolitical trends are being accelerated. There was a growing rivalry between the United States and China. But that rivalry has now been put on hyper speed because the pandemic has brought up so many issues relating to the pandemic, the World Health Organization, the trustworthiness of the Chinese government, the future of trade. All that is now on fast forward, and we are watching to see what happens as the United States and China move in a much more confrontational direction than for the last 40 years.
Farid, você argumenta que o que importa para enfrentar o desafio da pandemia não é a quantidade de governo, não é o tamanho de um governo, mas a sua qualidade. Vamos focar um momento em saúde pública. Por si só, a existência de um sistema de saúde público não é garantia de sucesso. Por exemplo, tanto Taiwan quanto a Inglaterra possuem um sistema de saúde público, mas tiveram resultados opostos. Ao mesmo tempo, países com melhor desempenho na pandemia, como Taiwan mesmo, Coreia do Sul, Singapura, Hong Kong, não são conhecidos por terem uma máquina governamental alargada, mas todos têm um sistema de saúde público universal. A qualidade dos governos foi definitivamente um fator de sucesso, mas um sistema integrado de saúde pública não seria o outro?
So there's no question that the countries, as you put it exactly right, the countries that did the best were countries which have spent a lot of time thinking about and designing good government. Not big, not small, but efficient, flexible agencies that are well-funded, that are staffed by the best people, where the staff and the agencies have a lot of power and autonomy, so they're not constantly micromanaged and over-regulated. So this is not just a problem from the left or the right, But I think it's fair to say that over the last 40 years, there has been a philosophy that said government can't do anything. Government agencies are too big. This is the Reagan-Thatcher philosophy. And all of that created a poisonous atmosphere in some countries where the bureaucracies had too little money, they had too many regulations, they were not able to perform. So that is the primary reason. However, if you talk to people in Taiwan, the experts who ran the program, in Singapore, in South Korea, they will all tell you that having a universal public health system helped a great deal. It's not a guarantee, as you say. Britain also had one and it did badly. But what it does allow for is the easy access to centralized sources of data, centralized decision making. And this is one of those cases where it is a real collective problem, and so if you look at America's system without a universal system, with 50 states running their own healthcare policies, you can see why the United States has ended up with 4% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's COVID deaths, even though the United States spends on healthcare 3 times as much as Taiwan per person. So the problem has not been money. The problem is a badly designed system. And when you don't have universal healthcare, it means it's very patchy. It's very leaky. There are lots of gaps. And the problem when you face a pandemic, when you face a public health crisis, we are all in it together. If there are 10% of the population that doesn't have good healthcare or doesn't want to even test themselves because they're scared that they can't pay for the test, or what if they're sick, they don't have money for the treatment, and so they don't do anything and they get sick, we're all suffering. So that the need for a collective approach in this particular case, I think clearly makes you understand a universal system has many advantages. There are some disadvantages, but for public health crises, a universal healthcare system helps a lot.
Farid, o capitalismo americano é historicamente modelo para o resto do mundo, mas você faz uma declaração muito forte no livro que o capitalismo americano está quebrado. E uma das lições que você tira dessa pandemia é que os mercados por si só não são suficientes. O que mudou, Farid?
Well, part of it came out of this understanding of what is happening to inequality. But let's look at it more generally and say what is happening today with markets is they are moving very fast. They'll be very dynamic. You're getting a lot of innovation, but you have 2 or 3 distinctive problems. You are having a lot of crises. If you think of the last 25 years and think of the number of crises, collapses, crashes we have had in the economic and financial markets, the Latin American debt crisis, the tequila crisis, the East Asian crisis, the Russian default, long-term capital collapsing, the tech bubble bursting, the housing bubble bursting, the great financial collapse of 2008, 2009, and now the pandemic-related economic issues. A lot of volatility. The second problem is you are seeing the rise of real powerful monopolies on a scale that people have never almost seen before. When you think of the power of Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, it is beyond anything that the largest companies in the world had before, because they literally own their markets. Google dominates 90% of search. Facebook is so powerful in social media that it's difficult to even remember what its competitors are. And this problem can't be solved by markets, because this is the market solution. It is probably the most efficient thing to do for everyone to buy everything on Amazon. But what does that do to all the independent stores in the world, all the independent booksellers, the hardware stores, every kind of business? So we cannot look to markets to solve these problems. The problems are being created by markets. We have to look to government, to regulation, to redistribution as one path to deal with this. Otherwise, we will end up in a world where there are 100 companies and then all the business is very efficiently being done just by those companies. So the digital world, the information revolution, globalization, all these things have created a reality that we need more than markets. We need markets, don't get me wrong. Markets provide efficiency. They provide innovation. They provide dynamism. We want all of that. but we also want a situation where people have a chance to be employed. People have the opportunity to have a decent living. The ladder of opportunity keeps providing for people at the bottom, even though they may be unsuccessful, in the short term. We are all citizens. We are all members of a country, and we cannot be treated purely as economic beings. We are also social, political, moral beings, and government and politics has to take care of that.
Refletindo sobre a pandemia, seu colega de CNN, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, disse que a ciência pode fazer coisas incríveis, mas não pode nos salvar de nós mesmos. Seu livro menciona o Brasil, entre outros países, como um lugar onde as pessoas se recusam a cumprir as recomendações dos profissionais de saúde, uma conduta incentivada pelo próprio presidente Bolsonaro, que governa, segundo você diz no livro, por instinto e pela celebração da ignorância. Farid, qual o papel do populismo nessa pandemia?
There's no question that populism has made the crisis worse in almost every country where populist governments have been in charge. You look at the United States, you look at Britain, you look at Brazil, you can see it in Eastern Europe, and even within the United States, you can see the more populous states going more difficulty than the less populous states. Now, I think that this is a great tragedy because, look, populism is here. It is, there are people who feel in some way that these populist parties speak for them. I think most of these populist leaders are fooling their supporters. They're lying to them. They're tricking them. They believe they're doing something for them, but they're not actually delivering. But I think that we have to ask ourselves, what is the advice we would give to these populist leaders? And my advice would be, look, it's possible for you to extend your support and your sympathy and provide for your people in whatever way you want symbolically, but follow the science, follow the facts, follow the evidence, and help them understand it. The part of the issue here is to lead, not to follow. And I would give you an example of Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson began the pandemic very poorly, just like Trump and Bolsonaro. But after he got the disease himself and after he saw what was happening, he has changed course. He has become much more sensible, much more sober. And as a result, with the vaccines, Britain is actually doing better than almost any country in the world. Britain has raced ahead, is vaccinating at a pace the only two countries better are two very small countries. Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Britain is number 3 in the world, ahead of the United States. So I think with Bolsonaro, look, there are people in Bolsonaro's government who are very smart people. His economics team in general has tended to be very smart. Why can they not convince him that this is a case where you have to lead, you have to show people how to combine whatever populism you have with fact, with science, with evidence. And if you do that, look at Boris Johnson. He has managed to stay in power. So that's my hope, because otherwise we're stuck in this terrible dynamic between the elites and the masses and each side distrusting each other. We have to find a way to build some bridges.
Farid, assim que a pandemia surgiu, nós vimos vários países olhando para dentro, desconfiando de soluções multilaterais, fechando fronteiras, se preocupando com a dependência internacional de produção de suprimentos médicos, enfim, clamando por mais independência. Esse movimento segue a filosofia America First do ex-presidente Trump. Você, por outro lado, proclama que a globalização não está morta. Por que você diz isso?
Well, one just has to look at the evidence. Don't look at what people are saying. Politicians are very good at making big, fancy speeches that they think the public want to hear. But look at what they're actually doing. So I agree with hearing all these speeches about nationalism, returning supply chains back home, protecting the motherland. But look at what's happened in the last year. The European Union and China have signed their biggest trade and investment deal ever. The 15 countries in Asia, including China, the 15 major countries, have signed the largest free trade deal in the history of the world, the Regional Economic Program. Africa, the African countries have come together and created a free trade pact. So what you are seeing is that people are actually moving ahead with free trade. Why? Very simple reason. It's how you make more money. It's how you, by trading more with more people, is how you're going to raise GDP. And especially during a pandemic that has depressed growth, everyone is searching for growth. So in a time like this, what people are looking for is how can I grow my economy? How can I raise the standards of living? How can I bring innovation to my economy? And for all that, you need trade. Look, even the United States is the exception. Under Trump, we went through a very protectionist phase. But even for the United States, at the end of the day, the answer is obvious. We're 4% of the world's population. If you don't trade with the other 96% of the world, your market is very small. And there is a limit to how much your market can do, even though we are the largest economy in the world, right? So for everyone, at the end of the day, you're only going to grow. You're only going to widen your horizons economically, socially, politically, if you look around and see what everybody else is doing and try to be part of a larger world than your own.
Outra tendência que a pandemia tem exacerbado é a animosidade entre China e Estados Unidos, o que faz muita gente temer pela possibilidade de uma guerra, ou pelo menos de uma nova Guerra Fria. Mas você diz que se as tensões entre as duas potências são inevitáveis, os conflitos não são. Então, Farid, como evitar o pior cenário nesse caso?
I think the great danger is that we are moving in a scenario, in a situation where politically, domestically, it sounds very good to be very tough on China in the United States. You know, it sounds like you're standing up against the bully, you're in favor of freedom and democracy, you're against the big evil Chinese state. What we forget is the Chinese have their own politics as well. China has its own nationalism. And all this American rhetoric and some actions are feeding a Chinese nationalism and a Chinese aggression. And in a strange sense, we are each ratcheting up so that the hardliners on each side are feeding each other. And the danger is that you get to a point where it's very difficult to back down. It's very difficult to compromise. It's very difficult to look for negotiated solutions. And the truth of the matter is, if you want any progress on any of the major issues in the world, say climate change, reforming the world trade system, you have to get the world's number one and number two power to agree, at least to work together, to talk to each other. So it's an incredibly dangerous moment we're in. Because as I say, we are in a bipolar world. There are two big powers above all the others. And how they relate to one another will determine whether we end up in another 40-year Cold War or whether we can find a way to all live together on this planet.
Eu gostaria de terminar com uma pergunta que sai um pouquinho do assunto, mas que poderia facilmente ser o tema, o título do seu próximo livro. Farid, quais são as lições para o mundo pós-Trump?
The lessons for post-Trump world are probably first the obvious one, which is that democracy is fragile, that it needs to be protected. You know, I wrote about this problem of illiberal democracy 20 years ago, 25 years ago, where you have democratic elections, but then the person who's elected chooses to use that power to undermine democracy, to do away with the rule of law, to engage in massive corruption, to persecute his political opponents. And these problems are ones that Brazilians are also familiar with. So one thing to remember is that democracy is fragile and that no institution, no concept like the rule of law matters unless people are willing to defend it. People have to be willing to fight for these things, to do their jobs, not to give in to political power. At the end of the day, what's interesting about the phenomenon in America is that our democratic system worked. I think that people don't focus enough on this, which is to say, think about what happened. You had a real demagogue who absolutely wanted to maintain power, did not want to leave office, even though he was defeated in an election. And yet, you had the election during a pandemic, you had record turnout, In all 50 states, the election was held peacefully and without any irregularities. All 50 states certified. There were challenges, there were legal challenges. All of them were dealt with within a few weeks. Every challenge that required a recount, recounts were done. Every challenge that involved a court case, there were 65 court cases, and the courts heard them within 2 days. And everyone affirmed the election, affirmed the legitimacy of the ballot. And then finally, Trump tried to get his own vice president to overturn the results, and that failed as well. And then he gets the crowd to go into Capitol Hill, and that fails as well. So I know it looks scary on TV, but if you think about it historically, the United States went through a very tough time, but it survived, and it actually came out of it stronger. So I believe that the post-Trump era shows you that democracy is fragile, but it can survive. It can even get stronger with these challenges. The biggest issue, I think, going forward is going to be for all those who want to speak for these people, who they say are neglected or left behind, or the rural people, the less educated people. You have to find a constructive program that helps these people, that really lifts them up. Otherwise, all you are engaging in is fear, destruction, nihilism, and what you will end up doing is you'll destroy the whole country. Instead of that, focus on a constructive program that helps bring these people up. If you do that, and I think we've all gotten a wake-up call. Trump, Bolsonaro, Brexit, this is all a wake-up call. We need to recognize that there are people who feel left behind, but we have to find a constructive way to help them, not just give in to anger, bitterness, hatred. It's much easier to hate. It's much harder to build. But clearly the answer is, let's all try to build something together.
Mais uma vez, o livro é 10 lições para o mundo pós-pandemia, chegando no Brasil agora, dia 24 de fevereiro. Fareed Zakaria, muito obrigado. Foi uma honra ter você aqui no programa.
This has been very stimulating and fun for me. Thanks for having me.